A philosopher died in 1990, and almost nobody outside Norway noticed. Peter Wessel Zapffe spent his life arguing that human consciousness was a tragic mistake, that we're cursed with minds too aware for our own good, and that the kindest thing we could do for future generations would be to stop creating them. Then he climbed mountains, took photographs, wrote comedy, and lived to 90. December 18th, 1899. Tromsø, Norway, the Arctic Circle, a town where the sun doesn't rise for 2 months each winter and doesn't set for 2 months each summer. This is where Peter Wessel Zapffe entered the world, into a household that had everything except warmth. His father, Fritz Gottlieb Zapffe, ran an apothecary. Not just any apothecary, but one that supplied polar expeditions. Fritz was friends with Roald Amundsen, the man who had beat Robert Scott to the South Pole. When Amundsen needed rations and materials for his attempts to conquer the frozen ends of the earth, he came to Fritz Zapffel's shop in Tromsø. The elder Zapffe was a photographer too, meticulous and exacting. His son would inherit both the camera and the temperament. Peter's mother, Gudrun Wessel, brought aristocratic blood to the marriage. She was descended from Peter Tordenskjold, a Danish Norwegian vice-admiral whose name meant Thundershield, upper middle class by any measure, respectable, proper, and cold. Zapffe would later describe his childhood as defined by tough discipline. That's putting it mildly. From his earliest years, he developed what he called a strong aversion to authority. When you grow up under rigid control, in a place where nature itself seems hostile to human life, where darkness swallows months at a time, certain questions start forming. Why are we here? What's the point of all this suffering? Why does consciousness hurt? Tromsø wasn't charming. It was brutal. The subarctic climate meant survival required constant effort. Fjords carved the landscape into fragments. Mountains loomed over everything. The town sat on an island, isolated, dark half the year, exposed to midnight sun the other half. Your body never knew what time it was. Your mind had to adjust to extremes that felt unnatural. For a boy with a questioning temperament and a father who demanded obedience, this was the perfect incubator for philosophical pessimism. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Young Peter was nearsighted, myopic. The world was blurry unless he got close to it. At age 12, his father handed him a camera. Fritz Zapffe was a skilled photographer, and he saw an opportunity. If his son couldn't see the world clearly with his eyes, maybe he could see it through a lens. Photography became Peter's compensation for poor vision. It also became something more. When you photograph something, you're choosing what matters. You're framing reality, deciding what to include and what to exclude. You're exercising control over chaos. For a boy growing up in an environment that felt hostile and arbitrary, this must have been intoxicating. He took thousands of photographs over his lifetime. Norway has archived them as cultural heritage. Mountains mostly. Ice, rock, empty spaces where humans didn't belong but ventured anyway. But the camera couldn't answer the questions forming in his mind. Why this? Why anything? Why the relentless pressure to exist when existence seemed designed to create suffering? His father pushed him toward respectability. Law school, a profession, something solid. Peter resisted, but not openly. Open resistance would have been crushed. Instead, he complied while nurturing a growing contempt for the entire structure of expectation and obligation that society tried to impose. In 1918, at 19, Zapffe left Tromsø for Oslo to study law. His father had pressed him into it, demanded it, really. And Peter went because what else could he do? But something happened in Oslo that changed everything. He discovered mountains he could actually climb. Kolsås, a wooded mountain ridge in Bærum just outside the capital. Nothing dramatic by Norwegian standards, but it was accessible, and it was vertical, and it was there. Zapffe taught himself to climb. No guides, no formal instruction, just trial and error and a willingness to risk falling. Why would someone with poor eyesight deliberately put himself in situations where depth perception meant the difference between life and death? Maybe that's exactly why. When you're on a rock face, the philosophical questions disappear. There's only the next handhold, the next placement, the immediate problem of not dying. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe climbing was the perfect metaphor for existence itself. Meaningless struggle against gravity and entropy. Effort that leads nowhere except back down to where you started, assuming you survive. As Zapffe would later write, mountaineering was as meaningless as life itself. But that comes later. For now, he's a law student who climbs. And then he met Arne Næss. Næss was 12 years younger, but already displaying the confidence that would later make him one of Norway's most famous philosophers. He was brilliant, energetic, and he loved climbing. The two men bonded immediately over their shared passion for vertical rock and philosophical inquiry. Their friendship would last decades, though it would end badly. Næss was optimistic, whereas Zapffe was pessimistic. Næss believed in deep ecology, in humanity's potential to live harmoniously with nature. Zapffe believed humanity was nature's mistake, a cosmic error that should gracefully exit the stage. But that tension was still years away. For now, they climbed together. They talked philosophy. They pushed each other up Norway's peaks and through intellectual territory that most people never explored. Zapfe's legal studies continued. He attended lectures, took exams, played the role of dutiful student. But his heart wasn't in jurisprudence. His mind was elsewhere, wrestling with bigger questions. Questions about consciousness, about suffering, about why humans seemed uniquely cursed with the ability to see their own meaninglessness. Then came 1923, his final law exam, and Peter Wessel Zapffe did something that perfectly captured his relationship with authority and expectation. He answered one of the exam questions entirely in rhyme. Imagine the examiner's faces. Here's this serious legal examination, careers hanging in the balance, and this candidate is writing poetry, rhyming couplets about contract law or whatever the question addressed. It was brilliant and absurd and deeply subversive. It was also technically correct. He passed, he became a qualified lawyer, and then he immediately returned to Tromsø and took a job as a jurist, which he clearly had no passion for. What he did have passion for was climbing. Between 1924 and 1928, Zapffe completed more than 20 first ascents in the mountains around Tromsø. These weren't casual hikes. These were serious climbs, technical routes that no one had successfully completed before. Tommeltot in Ulsfjorden, 1924. Småtind in Kvaløya, 1925. Bensfjordtind between Malangen and Balsfjorden. The names meant nothing to people outside the climbing community, but within it, Zapffe was becoming known. He wrote about these climbs too. Not dry technical reports, but humorous, self-aware narratives that captured both the physical challenge and the absurdity of the enterprise. He drew cartoons. His personality was splitting into fascinating contradictions. The pessimistic philosopher who laughed at existence while risking his life on rock faces. In 1926, he climbed the Hollenderen summit in Kvaløya. Decades later, in 1987, they named the highest peak after him. Zapfestind, the top of Zapffe, a permanent marker of temporary achievement. Then 1928 brought something that would connect Zapfe's world to history in an unexpected way. Umberto Nobile's airship, the Italia, crashed in the Arctic after attempting to fly over the North Pole. The story made international headlines. Rescue attempts were launched, and Roald Amundsen, the famous polar explorer and friend of the Zapffe family, joined the search effort. Peter Zapffe volunteered as an interpreter. He spoke German fluently, which was crucial for communicating with the Italian survivors and the international rescue teams. He served on the icebreaker Isbjørn with his father. They were searching for the crashed airship crew, trying to reach them before the Arctic killed them. The rescue was partially successful. Some of Nobel's crew survived, but Amundsen's plane disappeared during the search. The famous explorer was never found. The man who had conquered both poles, who had achieved what seemed impossible, vanished into the frozen north he'd spent his life challenging. Zapffe was there for all of it, 28 years old, working as an interpreter on an icebreaker, watching the Arctic swallow one of history's greatest adventurers. What does that do to your philosophy? What does it confirm about existence when you watch competence and courage mean nothing against indifferent nature? The expedition ended. Amundsen was gone, and on June 5, 1929, Zapffe left Tromsø. He found a room on Erling Skjalgesund Street in Christiania, living frugally, and descended into what he later described as a mentally catastrophic state. His own words from this period are chilling. The idea of death as the greatest consolation and escape, and which is always at hand, penetrates me with even greater force. This wasn't teenage angst. This was a 29-year-old trained lawyer, an accomplished mountaineer confronting the void at the center of existence. And unlike most people who have these thoughts and then distract themselves back into normal life, Zapffe decided to think it through, completely, systematically. He'd been a lawyer because his father demanded it. He'd climbed mountains because they were there, and climbing quieted the noise in his head. But what he really wanted to do was understand tragedy. Not theatrical tragedy, not the genre, actual tragedy, the tragedy of consciousness itself. So he enrolled at the University of Oslo to study comparative literature. His focus was Ibsen, Norway's great dramatist. But as he dug into Ibsen's work, as he analysed the structure of tragic drama, something clicked. The thesis he was planning started growing beyond the bounds of a master's degree. Fredrik Pasha, a historian of literature, recognised what was happening. He told Zapffe to forget the masters and go straight for a doctoral dissertation. Write the big book. Say everything you have to say about tragedy. And Zapffe did. Through the 1930s, while Europe was sliding toward another catastrophic war, while fascism was rising and democracies were failing, Peter Wessel Zapffe sat in Oslo and wrote about why human existence was fundamentally, biologically tragic. The core idea was forming. Humans have overdeveloped consciousness. We're aware of our own mortality in ways that other animals aren't. We can conceptualize the heat death of the universe. We can see the cruelty and indifference of natural selection. We can recognize that our lives have no inherent meaning or purpose, and this awareness is incompatible with the biological drive to survive and reproduce. We're animals programmed to continue existing, but we're also philosophers capable of recognizing that continuing to exist just creates more suffering. It's a paradox, a biological absurdity, and according to Zapffe, it explained everything about human behavior. All our religions, our political systems, our entertainment, our busy work, all of it was elaborate machinery designed to keep us from fully confronting the implications of our own consciousness. He identified 4 mechanisms that humans use to cope with this overdeveloped awareness. Isolation, pushing disturbing thoughts out of consciousness. Anchoring, fixing attention on values or ideals to create artificial meaning. Distraction, keeping the mind busy to prevent it from turning inward. Sublimation, transforming existential dread into art or philosophy. Zapffe himself was using sublimation. He was turning his existential horror into a doctoral dissertation. It was the only way to make the burden bearable. But we're getting ahead again. The dissertation wasn't finished yet. It was 1940. Norway was about to be occupied by Nazi Germany, and Zapffe was about to defend a philosophical work arguing that human existence was a mistake in front of a committee that included his old climbing partner, Arne Næss. The world was burning, and Zapffe was trying to explain why consciousness was the match. The defence took place in autumn 1941. By then, Norway had been under German occupation for over a year. Wehrmacht soldiers patrolled Oslo's streets. Quisling's collaborationist government was attempting to reshape Norwegian society according to Nazi principles. The university was a contested space, caught between maintaining intellectual independence and surviving under occupation. Zapffe's dissertation committee included 3 men: Frederick Pasha, his mentor, Francis Bull, another literature scholar, and Arne Næss. Næss had changed since their climbing days together. He was now a professor, having completed his own doctorate years earlier. He joined the resistance movement, risking his life in underground work against the occupation. But when Zapffe's defense was scheduled, Næss took time away from that dangerous work to serve as opponent. The role of opponent in a Norwegian doctoral defense is specific. You're not there to rubber stamp the dissertation. You're there to attack it, to test whether the candidate can defend their ideas under rigorous questioning. It's adversarial by design. Næss came prepared. He'd read all 600 pages of Zapffe's manuscript multiple times. He knew where the arguments were vulnerable. The defense lasted hours. Zapffe stood at the front of the room, defending his claim that human consciousness was a biological mistake. That tragedy wasn't just a feature of certain lives or certain historical moments, but was built into the structure of human existence itself. That we were animals cursed with the ability to understand our own meaninglessness. Næss pushed back hard. If consciousness is so maladaptive, why hasn't evolution eliminated it? If existence is truly unbearable, why do humans persist? If the 4 mechanisms of repression are universal, doesn't that suggest they're working? That they're adaptive rather than pathological? Zapffe held his ground. The mechanisms weren't evidence that consciousness was adaptive. They were evidence of how desperately humans had to work to avoid confronting reality. Like a man with a broken leg who develops elaborate ways to avoid putting weight on it. The crutches don't prove the leg is fine, they prove it's broken. The back and forth continued. Philosophical, biological, psychological arguments layered on top of each other. Meanwhile, outside the university walls, the occupation ground on. People were being arrested. Resistance fighters were being executed. The world was demonstrating Zapffe's thesis in real time. After the required shortening of the manuscript, Zapffe was awarded his doctorate that autumn. He was now Dr. Peter Wessel Zapffe, a philosopher with a systematic theory of human tragedy. But here's what's strange. The dissertation was immediately recognized as important. It was published as a book in 1941 and went through multiple editions. Norwegian intellectuals read it, debated it, cited it. Zapffe had established himself as one of the most original philosophical voices in Norway. Yet he never became a professor. He was offered a position at the University of Oslo after the war. He turned it down. Tells you something crucial about Zapffe's relationship to his own philosophy. He didn't want to be part of the institutional machinery. Universities, like churches and governments, were anchoring mechanisms. They provided structure, meaning, career progression, the illusion that what you were doing mattered in some cosmic sense. Zapffe had just written 600 pages arguing that all such institutions were elaborate distractions from the void. He wasn't going to immediately sign up to perpetuate the system. Instead, he became a freelancer, a writer, essayist, occasional lecturer. He supported himself through his pen, writing everything from philosophical essays to humorous mountain climbing stories to plays. He maintained his independence, his ability to say what he actually thought, without institutional constraints. After the war, he did teach one course at the University of Oslo, an introductory philosophy course, but it was temporary on his terms. He never committed to the academic path. This decision shaped everything that followed. Zapffe remained an outsider. Not obscure, he was well known in Norwegian intellectual circles, but operating at an angle to the mainstream. He could write what he wanted, think what he wanted. He wasn't building a career or cultivating students or playing academic politics. But let's go back to 1933, before the dissertation, before the war. Because there's a text we need to talk about. The text that would eventually make Zapffe famous beyond Norway, though not until long after his death. In 1933, Zapffe published a short essay in a Norwegian journal, about 10 pages long. Its title was Den siste Messias, the Last Messiah. This essay was the concentrated essence of what would later become the 600-page dissertation. But where the dissertation was systematic and scholarly, building its arguments through careful analysis of tragedy in literature and philosophy, the Last Messiah was prophetic, apocalyptic. It read less like academic philosophy and more like scripture from a dark religion. The essay opens with an image: humanity as a species that has evolved beyond its nature. We've developed consciousness, this extraordinary tool for understanding the world, but the tool has turned against us. We can now see things that other animals can't see, and what we see is unbearable. We see that we're going to die, not as an abstract concept, but as a concrete certainty. Every person you love will die. You will die. Everything you create will eventually decay into nothing. The universe itself will end in heat death, all energy dissipated, all structure dissolved. We see that natural selection, the process that created us, is blind and cruel. It doesn't care about our suffering. It has no purpose beyond replication. We're survival machines built by genes that don't care whether we're happy or miserable, only whether we reproduce. We see that there's no inherent meaning or purpose to existence, no cosmic plan, no divine justice, just physics and chemistry and biology grinding forward according to natural law. And we see that most of what humans do, all our busy activity, is designed to keep us from fully processing these facts. We're constantly distracting ourselves, anchoring ourselves to artificial values, isolating disturbing thoughts, sublimating our dread into art or philosophy. This is what Zapffe meant by overdeveloped consciousness. We're aware enough to see the horror, but we're still biological organisms programmed to keep existing. The contradiction is unbearable. So we develop elaborate psychological mechanisms to avoid looking directly at reality. The Last Messiah describes these mechanisms, the same four that would appear in the dissertation. But then it goes further. It asks what would happen if someone actually stopped using them. If someone looked at existence without any protective filters, this person, Zapffe suggests, would be the last Messiah, not a savior who offers hope or redemption, a messenger who delivers the final terrible truth. The message would be simple: stop reproducing. Let the human species end. It's the only merciful response to the tragedy of consciousness. The essay ends with a reversal of the biblical command. God told humanity to be fruitful and multiply. The last Messiah's message would be, know yourselves, be infertile, and let the earth be silent after you. It's one of the bleakest texts in philosophy. No consolation, no escape hatch, just the suggestion that the kindest thing humanity could do would be to voluntarily go extinct. When the essay was published in 1933, it didn't cause much stir. It appeared in a Norwegian journal with limited circulation. Some intellectuals read it, some dismissed it as pessimistic extremism. But it didn't break through to a wider audience. The dissertation, published in 1941, had more impact. It was a serious scholarly work that had to be taken seriously, but even that remained mostly within Norwegian academia. Zapffe wrote in Norwegian. His work wasn't translated. For decades, his philosophy remained a largely Norwegian phenomenon. He kept writing essays, stories, plays, many focused on mountain climbing, his other great passion. These weren't philosophical treatises. They were often funny, filled with the kind of dark humour you'd expect from someone with Zapffe's worldview. He described climbing as meaningless, which, for him, was the highest compliment. It was pure activity, done for its own sake, with no pretense of serving some higher purpose. His climbing writing became classics in Norway, collected in a book called Barske Gleder, Rough Joys, published in 1969. These essays opened up the mountains of northern Norway to readers who'd never been there. His descriptions combined precise observation with philosophical reflection and absurdist humour. In one essay, he describes a sleeping bag as an artificial fur which man creeps in to sleep in an otherwise deathly climate. That's Zapffe in a sentence. The practical observation, the reminder of death, the slightly detached perspective that makes the familiar seem strange. He was also an early environmentalist, though his reasoning was characteristically dark. He didn't want to protect nature for nature's sake. He wanted to prevent humans from colonizing and destroying the last wild places. The mountains should remain intact, he argued, without human intervention. Even trail markers should be removed. Let the wilderness be wilderness. His environmental philosophy came from the same source as his pessimism. Humans were the problem. Our consciousness, our technology, our endless need to reshape the world according to our purposes, these were destructive forces. The Earth would be better without us. This wasn't mainstream environmentalism. He wasn't arguing for sustainable development or green technology. He was arguing for human restraint bordering on absence. Leave the mountains alone. Leave the wilderness alone. Minimize your impact by minimizing yourself. In his personal life, Zapffe practiced what he preached. He married twice, first to Bergljot Espelin Johnson in 1935. They divorced in 1941, the same year his dissertation was published, then to Berit Riis Christensen in 1952. That marriage lasted until his death. He never had children. This was deliberate, a choice that followed directly from his philosophy. If existence is suffering, if consciousness is a curse, the most ethical thing you can do is not create more conscious beings. Antinatalism wasn't just theory for Zapffe, it was practice. His friendship with Arne Næss eventually ended. They'd been close since their climbing days in the 1920s. They'd defended dissertations in the same intellectual community, but their personalities were fundamentally different. Næss was optimistic, engaged with the world, building a philosophy of deep ecology that saw nature as intrinsically valuable. He took life seriously, but with a kind of joy. Zapffe thought Næss didn't take life seriously enough, or rather, took it seriously in the wrong way. Næss's deep ecology seemed like another anchoring mechanism to Zapffe, another way of creating meaning where there was none. Eventually, Zapffe ended the friendship. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. Here were two brilliant philosophers, both concerned with the humanity's relationship to nature, both accomplished mountaineers. They'd been friends for decades, and Zapffe walked away because Næss was too optimistic, too willing to find value in existence. This wasn't cruelty on Zapfe's part, it was consistency. If you actually believe consciousness is a curse and existence is tragic, you can't maintain close friendships with people who radiate the opposite view. Their very presence becomes a challenge to your philosophy, easier to withdraw. Zapffe withdrew from many things over the years. Not into hermitage, he kept writing and lecturing and climbing, but into a kind of philosophical isolation. He'd mapped the territory of human tragedy and found it uninhabitable. So he lived on the edges, in the spaces between full engagement and complete retreat. His work remained largely unknown outside Norway for decades. The dissertation was never translated into English. The Last Messiah essay remained in Norwegian. A few scholars knew about him, a few philosophers cited him, but he wasn't part of the international conversation. That started to change slowly in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as pessimistic philosophy gained new attention, as antinatalism moved from fringe position to serious philosophical debate, as environmental crisis made Zapfe's dark warnings seem less like extremism and more like prophecy. In 2004, a Swedish translator named Gisla Tangenäs translated The Last Messiah into English. It appeared in a journal called Philosophy Now. Suddenly, Zapfe's most concentrated statement of his philosophy was accessible to English readers. The essay found an audience, not a huge one, but a dedicated one. People who'd been thinking similar thoughts, feeling similar dread, found in Zapffe someone who'd articulated their inchoate anxiety. The essay spread online, shared in philosophy forums, cited in blog posts, discussed by people who'd never heard of the dissertation but connected immediately with this 10-page manifesto of existential horror. Then in 2017, something shifted the trajectory permanently. David Benatar, the South African philosopher who'd written Better Never to Have Been, one of the most rigorous defences of antinatalism in contemporary philosophy, mentioned Zapffe in his work. Not extensively, but enough. Enough to create a breadcrumb trail for people already moving in that direction. Benatar's book had done something unusual. It took antinatalism, this fringe position that most philosophers dismissed without serious engagement, and forced the academic community to actually grapple with it. The arguments were too careful, too well constructed to ignore, and Benatar acknowledged Zapffe as a predecessor, someone who'd arrived at similar conclusions decades earlier through a different route. This created a feedback loop. People reading Benatar would discover Zapffe. People discovering Zapffe would find Benatar. The conversation expanded. YouTube videos appeared, analysing The Last Messiah. Reddit threads dissected the 4 mechanisms of defense. Philosophy podcasts devoted episodes to this obscure Norwegian thinker who diagnosed humanity's fundamental problem back in the 1930s. The timing mattered. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. The early 21st century brought a cascade of crises that made Zapffe's pessimism seem less like pathology and more like clear-eyed assessment. Climate change accelerating beyond worst-case scenarios, political systems fracturing, economic inequality reaching grotesque extremes, and underneath it all, a growing sense that maybe the entire human project was a mistake. Zapffe had said this in 1933. He'd looked at the trajectory of human civilization and concluded we were a tragic error, a species too conscious for its own good, destined to suffer until we finally accepted the only rational solution: stopping. No more humans means no more human suffering. Simple math. But here's what's strange about Zapffe's growing influence. Most people encountering his work don't become antinatalists. They don't stop having children or advocate for human extinction. Instead, they find in his framework something else entirely: a vocabulary for articulating experiences they've had but couldn't name. The 4 mechanisms: isolation, anchoring, distraction, sublimation, these resonate not as indictments, but as descriptions. Oh, that's what I'm doing when I scroll through social media for 3 hours instead of thinking about my actual problems. That's distraction. Oh, that's why I throw myself into work until I'm exhausted, why I need my job, or my political affiliation, or my identity as a parent to feel real. That's anchoring. Zapffe becomes useful even when you reject his conclusions. The diagnostic framework works independently of the prescription. You can acknowledge that humans use these mechanisms to cope with existential dread without agreeing that the solution is voluntary extinction. This is probably not what Zapffe intended. He wasn't trying to help people cope better with existence. He was trying to show them that coping is futile, that all our strategies are just elaborate ways of avoiding the truth. But intent doesn't control reception. Once ideas enter circulation, they mutate, adapt, serve purposes their creator never imagined. By the 2020s, Zapffe had become something like a cult figure in certain corners of the internet. Not a mainstream philosopher, never that, but recognizable to people who spent time in the darker regions of philosophical discussion. You'd see references in forums about antinatalism, about philosophical pessimism, about the ethics of procreation. Someone would mention the 4 mechanisms, and others would nod in recognition. Then in 2024, something happened that would have astonished Zapffe. His dissertation, Om de Tragiska, that 600-page monster that had never been translated, finally appeared in English. Ryan Schuler translated it. Peter Lang published it. And it came with introductory essays by Thomas Ligotti and David Benatar. Ligotti, the horror writer who'd written The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, his own descent into pessimistic philosophy. Benatar, the philosopher who'd made antinatalism academically respectable. These weren't random choices. They were the people Zapffe's work had influenced, directly or indirectly, across decades and languages. The translation arrived at a peculiar moment. Post-pandemic, climate crisis intensifying, political discourse increasingly apocalyptic. A book arguing that human existence is fundamentally tragic didn't seem as extreme as it might have in, say, 1995. It seemed like one possible interpretation of observable reality. Reviews started appearing. Some dismissed it as nihilistic nonsense. Others found it rigorous and disturbing. A few suggested it was the most honest philosophical work they'd encountered, willing to follow its premises to their logical conclusion, regardless of how uncomfortable that destination might be. What strikes you reading Om det Tragiska now, in English, is how systematic it is. This isn't a rant or a manifesto. It's a careful philosophical investigation into the nature of tragedy, building from biological foundations through psychological mechanisms to existential conclusions. Zapffe examines tragedy in literature, yes, but primarily as evidence of a deeper biological and existential condition. The central argument runs like this: tragedy occurs when an organism's interests come into irreconcilable conflict. For most animals, this is rare and situational. A deer can't escape a predator and can't fight back. Tragic situation, but isolated. For humans, the conflict is structural, built into our nature. Our consciousness allows us to understand that we're temporary, that meaning is constructed, that the universe doesn't care about us. But we also have a biological drive to survive, to find meaning, to matter. These interests can't be reconciled. We're trapped in permanent tragedy. This is bleaker than Camus' absurdism, which at least offers revolt as a response. It's darker than Sartre's existentialism, which suggests we can create authentic meaning through choice. Zapffe says no. The conflict is real and unsolvable. Our consciousness is the problem, and we can't think our way out of a problem caused by thinking. The four mechanisms are survival strategies, not solutions. They let us function day to day, but they don't resolve the underlying condition. We're still conscious. We still know what we know. The dread just gets pushed down, not eliminated. Reading Zapffe is uncomfortable because he doesn't offer consolation. Most philosophy, even pessimistic philosophy, eventually gestures towards some way of living with the difficulty, some practice or perspective that makes existence bearable. Zapffe doesn't do this. He describes the problem with clinical precision and suggests the only real solution is one we're biologically programmed to resist, stopping. But there's something else in his work that often gets missed in discussions of his pessimism. His writing on mountains, on nature, on the experience of being in wild places. This seems contradictory at first. If existence is suffering, why climb mountains? Why write lovingly about glaciers and storms and the specific quality of light above the tree line? The answer isn't simple, but it's there in the work if you look. Mountains for Zapffe represented something outside human meaning-making. They didn't care about us. They weren't there for us. They had no purpose related to human existence. And there was something honest about that, something clean. When you're on a mountain, you're confronted with your own insignificance in a way that's immediate and undeniable. The rock doesn't care if you summit. The weather doesn't adjust to your convenience. You're just another biological organism trying not to die in an environment you're not adapted for. No anchoring works here. No distraction helps. You're present in a way that's rare in ordinary life. Zapffe described mountaineering as meaningless as life itself. But this wasn't dismissive. It was acknowledgement. The mountain doesn't pretend to have meaning. It just is. And there's a kind of relief in that, in being in the presence of something that doesn't demand interpretation or significance. His environmental philosophy grew from the same root. Zapffe wasn't protecting nature because it was valuable for humans. He was trying to protect it from humans, from our need to make everything meaningful, useful, part of our story. He wanted mountains to remain indifferent, unmarked by our presence. This makes him one of the first eco-philosophers in Norway, though that label would have amused him. He wasn't advocating for sustainability so humans could continue existing. He was advocating for nature's independence from human purposes. Let the mountains be mountains. Let the wilderness be wilderness. Stop putting markers on every trail. Stop making nature accessible and manageable and safe. A mountain trip with signs is something completely different from a trip without them. That's Zapffe pushing back against the domestication of wild places, against the human need to control and categorize everything we encounter. The red teas of the Norwegian Tourist Association offended him not because they were ugly, but because they represented human imposition on something that should remain other. His photographs capture this. Thousands of images archived now as cultural heritage. Stark black and white shots of peaks and glaciers and storm clouds. No people in most of them, or when people appear, they're tiny, dwarfed by the landscape. The compositions emphasize scale, the overwhelming presence of geological time and natural force. He started photographing young, at 12, using his father's equipment. Partly, this was compensation for his myopia, a way of seeing clearly what his eyes couldn't capture unaided. But it became something more, a way of documenting what he valued, of preserving moments of honest encounter with the non-human. In Barska Gleder, his 1969 collection of essays about mountain experiences, he writes with this peculiar combination of dark philosophy and genuine affection for the physical world. The book title translates roughly as Rough Joys, and that captures something essential about his relationship with nature. Not comfort, not meaning, but the harsh satisfaction of being fully present in an indifferent environment. He describes a sleeping bag as an artificial fur which man creeps into sleep in an otherwise deathly climate. There's humour there, but also precision. We're not adapted for these places. We survive in them only through technology, through artificial extensions of our inadequate biology, and yet we go anyway, seeking something we can't quite name. The essays in Barska Gleder became classics of Norwegian outdoor writing. They opened up the mountains of North Norway to readers who'd never been there, made the experience vivid and immediate. But they also carried Zapffe's philosophical edge, his refusal to sentimentalize or romanticize nature. The mountain won't adapt to humans, but humans are welcome in the mountains. That's the tension. Nature doesn't care about us, but we can exist in it if we accept the terms. No special consideration, no meaning, just the raw fact of being alive in a place that could kill you. This connected to his environmental advocacy in ways that seemed contradictory, but made sense within his framework. He wanted to preserve wilderness not because humans needed it for recreation or spiritual renewal, but because it was one of the few remaining spaces not entirely colonized by human meaning-making. One of the few places where the four mechanisms might fail, where you had to confront existence without mediation. His eco-philosophy argued that humans are the ultimate tragic beings because we're capable of recognizing that Earth would be better without us. We can see the damage we cause. We can understand that our consciousness, our tool-making, our relentless transformation of everything we touch, all of it degrades the planet. And we can't stop. We're biologically driven to survive, to expand, to consume. Knowing this doesn't change it. This is decades before climate change became mainstream concern. Zapffe was making these arguments in the 1960s and 70s, when environmental awareness was just beginning to emerge. He saw the trajectory clearly. More humans means more impact. More impact means more damage. More damage means more suffering, both for us and for everything else. The math was simple and horrifying, but he didn't advocate for environmental activism in the conventional sense. What would be the point? Humans won't voluntarily limit themselves. We'll keep consuming, keep reproducing, keep transforming the world until we can't anymore. The tragedy isn't that we might destroy ourselves. The tragedy is that we're conscious enough to see it coming and powerless to stop it. This is where Zapffe's philosophy becomes almost unbearable, not because it's nihilistic, plenty of philosophers are nihilistic, because it's rigorous. He follows the logic wherever it leads, refuses to flinch, won't offer false hope or convenient exits. If consciousness is the problem, and consciousness can't be eliminated without death, then death is the only solution. Not death imposed, but death chosen. The slow, voluntary cessation of the human species through chosen childlessness. The last Messiah ends with that inverted biblical command, be infertile and let the earth be silent after you. Zapffe lived this. No children, no lineage. When he died in 1990, he left no descendants. He'd broken the chain of suffering at his own link. But most people didn't live this. They couldn't. The position was too extreme, too uncompromising, and Zapffe understood that. He wasn't trying to convert humanity to antinatalism. He knew it wouldn't work. The biological drive to reproduce is too strong. What he was doing was something else, documenting, bearing witness, showing what happens when you actually follow philosophical pessimism to its logical conclusion without flinching. This is where the contradiction lives. Zapffe wrote prolifically. Essays, plays, poetry, philosophical treatises. He engaged with the public, gave lectures, participated in debates. For someone who believed existence was a mistake, he was remarkably active in the world. He wasn't sitting in a cave waiting to die. He was creating, communicating, trying to make people understand something fundamental about the human condition. The answer to this apparent contradiction is sublimation, his fourth mechanism, the one he admitted using himself, taking the existential horror and transforming it into art, into philosophy, into something that could be shared. Not as a solution, but as a form of acknowledgement. We can't escape the trap of consciousness, but we can at least describe it accurately. We can create works that capture the truth of our situation, even if that truth is unbearable. His photography was part of this. Thousands of images now archived as cultural heritage. Mountains, landscapes, moments captured in the harsh northern light. His father had been a photographer, had given him equipment when he was 12, partly to compensate for his myopia. Zapffe's poor eyesight meant he experienced the world differently, through the mediation of lenses and frames. Maybe that shaped his philosophical perspective too, always seeing reality through a filter, never quite directly. The images in Baskerglede aren't just illustrations, they're integral to the text. Zapffe was reconstructing experience through photography, creating a kind of visual testimony to accompany his written observations. This is ekphrasis in reverse, not describing images with words, but using images to anchor words in specific moments of lived experience. His marriage history reveals something too. First marriage to Bergljot Espolin Johnson in 1935. Divorce in 1941. That's the same year Om de Tragiska was published. The connection might be coincidental, but the timing suggests something. Finishing the dissertation, defending it, getting the degree, all while his first marriage was ending. The personal and philosophical crises overlapping. Then 11 years alone before marrying Berit Riis Christensen in 1952. That marriage lasted until his death in 1990. 38 years. Berit outlived him by 18 years, dying in 2008. What was it like being married to Peter Wessel Zapffe? Living with someone who believed existence was a mistake, who had chosen not to have children precisely because bringing new consciousness into the world would be an act of cruelty. We don't have Berit's account, no memoir, no interviews that I can find. Just the fact of the marriage, the duration, the choice they made together to remain childless. She must have understood his philosophy, accepted it, maybe even shared it. Or maybe she loved him despite it, found ways to live with his darkness without being consumed by it. The friendship with Arne Næss is telling. They met in the late 1920s, bonded over climbing and philosophy. Næss was 12 years younger, already displaying the self-confidence and talent that would make him famous. Zapffe admired him. Næss admired Zapffe's analytical skill and use of language. It should have been a perfect intellectual partnership, but their personalities were fundamentally incompatible. Næss was playful, optimistic, engaged with the world in ways that Zapffe found insufficiently serious. When Næss later developed deep ecology, his philosophy emphasized interconnection, the intrinsic value of all life, a kind of spiritual relationship with nature. This was the opposite of Zapffe's view. Nature had no intrinsic value. Consciousness was a curse, not a gift. The best thing humans could do for the planet was disappear. Zapffe eventually ended the friendship, not over a specific incident, but because he felt Næss didn't take life seriously enough, didn't take people seriously enough. For Zapffe, existence was tragedy. For Næss, it was possibility. The gap was unbridgeable. This reveals something about Zapffe's character. He wasn't flexible, couldn't compromise on fundamentals. If you didn't share his view of existence as fundamentally flawed, you couldn't really be close to him. The philosophy wasn't just intellectual. It was personal, emotional, defining. It shaped every relationship, every interaction. His work as a lawyer shows the same pattern. He passed his exam in 1923, famously completing one task entirely in rhyme. This wasn't playfulness, it was contempt. A demonstration that he could succeed in the system while simultaneously mocking it. He worked as a jurist in Tromsø for a period after returning in 1925, but he didn't stay in law. It was too much about maintaining social order, about anchoring mechanisms he saw through completely. After World War II, he taught an introductory philosophy course at the University of Oslo as a freelancer. Not a professor, not part of the system. Just someone delivering knowledge on his own terms. He'd been offered a professorship after defending Om det Tragiske, but turned it down. Why would he want institutional affiliation? Institutions are anchoring mechanisms. Universities exist partly to transmit cultural values, to reproduce society across generations. Zapffe saw this clearly and wanted no part of it. Instead, he lived by his writing. Essays, monographs, poetry, plays, humorous pieces, making enough to survive but never becoming wealthy or famous in the conventional sense. He was known in Norway, respected in certain circles, but he never achieved the international recognition that Næss did. Partly because he wrote in Norwegian, partly because his work was too dark, too uncompromising. It didn't offer the kind of hopeful environmentalism that could build mass movements. The winter of 1940 was crucial, Norway under German occupation. Zapffe submitting his dissertation for evaluation. This wasn't just an academic exercise, it was a risk. The Nazis weren't friendly to pessimistic philosophy, to ideas that questioned the value of struggle and triumph. Zapffe was arguing that consciousness itself was a biological error, not exactly in line with theories of racial superiority and historical destiny. Næss served as one of the committee members while taking breaks from resistance work. The juxtaposition is striking. Næss fighting the occupation, actively resisting, Zapffe writing philosophy that suggested all human projects were ultimately futile. Both were forms of opposition to Nazism, but from completely different foundations. Næss believed in fighting for something better. Zapffe believed fighting revealed the tragic nature of consciousness, our inability to simply accept non-existence. After the war, after liberation, life could return to normal, except there was no normal for Zapffe. The war had proven his point in the most brutal way imaginable. Humans creating mechanized death, industrial genocide, the reduction of existence to pure suffering on an unprecedented scale. This wasn't an aberration, it was consciousness following its nature. The ability to plan, to organize, to create systems. Applied to destruction, because destruction is what consciousness does when it confronts the meaninglessness of existence without adequate defense mechanisms. His essays from the post-war period show this awareness. He wasn't writing about the war directly, but the shadow is there, in his environmental pieces, in his climbing stories, in his philosophical reflections. The knowledge that humans had just demonstrated again exactly what he'd been saying all along. We're capable of recognizing our impact and powerless to fundamentally change it. The climbing stories in Barskiglada take on different weight in this context. He's describing activities that are, in his own words, as meaningless as life itself. Climbing a mountain serves no purpose. It doesn't feed you, shelter you, advance any practical goal. You go up and then you come down. The whole thing is absurd, and yet people do it. They risk death for the experience of standing on a summit for a few minutes before descending. Why? Because it's a form of sublimation, a way to take the existential anxiety and channel it into something concrete. The mountain becomes an objective, a goal, something to anchor consciousness to. During the climb, you're not thinking about the meaninglessness of existence. You're thinking about the next handhold, the route, the weather, the immediate physical challenge. It's distraction and anchoring combined. And when you reach the summit, there's a moment of achievement, of having done something difficult. It doesn't mean anything in the cosmic sense, but it feels meaningful. That's enough. Zapffe understood this completely. He wasn't climbing despite his philosophy. He was climbing because of it. Finding moments where the four mechanisms could fail safely, where you could experience raw existence without the usual protections, and then descending back to normal life with the knowledge intact. The mountains were laboratories for testing his ideas about consciousness and survival. His environmental advocacy worked the same way. He wanted wilderness preserved not for human benefit, but for its own sake, or rather, for the sake of maintaining spaces where human meaning-making hadn't completely colonized reality. Every hiking trail marker, every tourist facility, every accommodation to human convenience, it all represented the expansion of our consciousness into spaces that should remain other. This is why he opposed even the Norwegian Tourist Association's red T markers, those painted symbols on rocks, guiding hikers along established routes. To most people, they're helpful, making the mountains more accessible. To Zapffe, they were violations. Human consciousness imposing itself on the landscape, domesticating the wild, turning genuine wilderness into managed nature. A mountain trip with signs is something completely different from a trip without them. He was right. Following markers is navigation by human design. Finding your own way requires engagement with the actual terrain, with uncertainty, with the possibility of being lost. One is safe, the other is real. And Zapffe always chose real over safe, even when real meant confronting the horror of consciousness without mediation. The essays Farewell Norway and Parting with Gauster captured this. Watching the landscape, he loved being transformed, made accessible, turned into recreation areas for people seeking distraction from their lives. He understood why they needed it. The four mechanisms require constant feeding. People need anchoring points, need distractions. Nature serves this function. But in serving it, nature ceases to be nature. It becomes another mechanism, another way to avoid the fundamental problem of consciousness. This is the core of his eco-philosophy. Humans are the ultimate tragic beings, because we can recognize that Earth would be better without us. We have the cognitive capacity to understand our impact, to see the damage we cause, to calculate the trajectory toward ecological collapse. And we can't change it. We're biologically driven to survive, to reproduce, to consume. Knowledge doesn't override biology. Other animals don't have this problem. A wolf doesn't wonder if the ecosystem would be better without wolves. A tree doesn't question its right to exist. Only humans carry this burden. Only we can see ourselves from the outside, judge ourselves, find ourselves wanting, and keep existing anyway. Zapffe's photography tells you everything about his philosophy, not through what he captured, but how. He started at 12, using his father's equipment, partly to compensate for his myopia. But the images he produced reveal something deeper than a hobby or compensation. They show someone looking at the world through a lens that both distances and intensifies reality. Norway has archived thousands of his photographs, cultural heritage now. Most of them document mountain expeditions, landscapes, climbing routes. On the surface, they're beautiful records of northern wilderness. Look closer, and you see what he was actually doing, creating ekphrasis from visual documentation, translating direct experience into aesthetic object. This is sublimation in its purest form. The camera puts a frame around reality. It selects what matters, excludes what doesn't. It transforms the overwhelming chaos of existence into something manageable, something you can hold and examine. Behind the camera, you're not just experiencing the mountain, you're composing it, controlling it, making it mean something through the act of capture. This isn't dishonest, it's survival. The same mechanism that let him write about climbing, let him photograph it. Distance through art. The sleeping bag description in Rough Joys captures this perfectly. An artificial fur which man creeps in to sleep in an otherwise deathly climate. That's not poetic flourish, that's precise observation. The sleeping bag is a mechanism, a defense against reality. You climb into this artificial construction to survive conditions that would kill you otherwise. Everything becomes metaphor when you understand what he's saying. The sleeping bag, the camera, the rope, the trail markers he hated, all mechanisms for managing consciousness, for making the unbearable bearable. The difference is which ones admit what they're doing and which ones pretend to be something else. His writing style matches this approach. Master of words, they called him. Burlesque humour and linguistic elegance. Northern Norwegian humour combined with philosophical precision. The combination seems contradictory until you understand the function. Humour is another mechanism. It distances. It transforms pain into something you can laugh at. Not because the pain isn't real, but because laughter makes it possible to acknowledge the pain without being destroyed by it. The 1969 collection Rough Joys brought his mountain essays to a national audience. People outside northern Norway discovered the world he'd been documenting for decades. They read about Stetind, about first ascents, about adventures in wilderness that most of them would never experience directly. The essays became classics of Norwegian outdoor literature. But they're not really about mountains. They're about consciousness, trying to find spaces where it can exist without the usual protections. Where the four mechanisms fail safely. Where you can experience the horror of being fully awake to reality and then descend back to normal life with the knowledge intact but manageable. This is why his environmental philosophy matters. He wasn't protecting nature for human benefit. He was trying to preserve spaces where reality remained unmediated by human meaning-making. Every development, every trail marker, every tourist facility represented consciousness, expanding into territory that should remain other. The red T markers of the Norwegian Tourist Association became a symbol of everything he opposed. To most people, they're helpful. They make mountains accessible to hikers who might get lost without them. Safety through human design. Navigation by following symbols rather than reading terrain. Zapffe saw violation. Human consciousness imposing itself on landscape that should remain wild. Domesticating the genuine into the managed. Turning wilderness into recreation areas designed for distraction. The mountain won't adapt to humans, but humans are welcome in the mountains. That's the core principle. Go to the mountain on its terms. Accept the risk. Navigate by reading rock and weather and slope, not by following painted symbols. Experience the mountain as it is, not as we'd like it to be. This sounds romantic until you remember what he actually believed about consciousness. He's not saying wilderness is good for you. He's saying it's one of the few places left where you can't avoid reality, where the mechanisms that usually protect you from recognizing the horror of existence don't function as well, where you have to be present with what is rather than what you wish were true. Most people don't want that. They want nature as backdrop for their anchoring and distraction. Instagram photos from the summit. Achievement unlocked. Stories to tell. Memories to organize consciousness around. Nature as mechanism rather than reality. He understood this completely. He wasn't judging people for needing these protections. He was observing that in serving this function, wilderness ceases to be wild. It becomes another tool for consciousness to use in its desperate attempt to avoid confronting what it actually is. The tragedy is recursive. We can see that we're destroying the very thing we claim to love. We can understand that our presence transforms wilderness into something else. We can recognize that accessibility and preservation are contradictory, and we can't stop. Biology drives us to make the world safe for ourselves. Consciousness lets us see what we're doing. Neither overrides the other. This is the eco-philosophical thesis at its clearest. Humans are tragic because we have the capacity to realize Earth would be better without us. Not better in some abstract way. Concretely better. More diverse, more stable, more wild. We can calculate the damage we cause. We can project the trajectory toward collapse. We can see ourselves from the outside and find ourselves wanting. And we keep existing anyway. Keep reproducing, keep consuming, keep expanding. Because knowing doesn't change what we are. A wolf doesn't wonder if the ecosystem would be better without wolves. Only humans carry this particular burden of knowledge without the ability to act on it. Zapffe's personal life embodied his philosophy. He married twice, first to Bergljot Espeland Jonsson in 1935, divorced in 1941, then to Berit Riis Christensen in 1952, remaining together until his death in 1990. Berit died in 2008, but no children. Ever. This wasn't accident or circumstance, it was choice. The last Messiah ends with an inversion of biblical command. Be fruitful and multiply becomes be infertile and let the earth be silent after you. He followed his own instruction, left no descendants, refused to perpetuate the tragedy of consciousness into another generation. This is where his philosophy becomes more than academic. Most people can read about antinatalism and find it interesting in an abstract way. Zapffe lived it, made the choice that his ideas demanded, accepted that if consciousness is the problem, the solution is to stop creating more of it. You can call this extreme, you can argue about whether it's right, but you can't accuse him of hypocrisy. He saw consciousness as tragedy and chose not to inflict it on anyone else. That's consistency most philosophers never achieve. His friendship with Arne Næss shows the limits of shared interests when fundamental worldviews diverge. They met in the 1920s, both young climbers in Oslo. 12 years separated them in age, but the mountains created common ground. They climbed together. They talked philosophy. They maintained connection for decades. Næss eventually became the more famous philosopher, developed deep ecology, got appointed professor while Zapffe was still finishing his doctoral thesis. Næss never hid his admiration for Zapffe's analytical skill and linguistic precision. But their personalities were fundamentally incompatible. Zapffe eventually ended the friendship. His reason tells you everything. Næss didn't take life or people seriously enough. This from someone who wrote extensively about meaninglessness and tragedy. But that's exactly the point. To Zapffe, the horror of consciousness demanded absolute seriousness. You could find humour in it, yes, sublimation through wit and observation, but underneath had to be recognition of the fundamental problem. Ness, for all his brilliance, approached existence with a lightness that Zapffe couldn't accept. Deep ecology celebrated nature and human connection to it. Zapffe saw nature as indifferent and human consciousness as catastrophic error. They could climb the same mountains and see completely different realities. The friendship ending reveals something about philosophical pessimism. It's not just intellectual position, it's lived experience. And if you truly believe consciousness is tragedy, anyone who seems to enjoy existence becomes incomprehensible. Not wrong necessarily, just operating in a framework you can't share. 1940 brought the doctoral defense. Om de tragiske, on the tragic. Over 600 pages of philosophical analysis arguing that tragedy isn't literary genre, but biological condition. Humans possess overdeveloped consciousness that renders us maladapted to life. Internal contradictions and existential tension are inevitable results. The timing matters. German-occupied Norway, defending a dissertation on human tragedy while actual tragedy unfolded across Europe. Ness took a break from resistance work to serve as opponent in the defense. This wasn't just academic exercise. This was philosophy happening in the middle of catastrophe. Zapffe got his doctorate. The thesis was published in 1941 and reprinted multiple times. It never got translated into English until 2024, when Ryan Schuler's translation finally appeared through Peter Lang. Thomas Ligotti and David Benatar wrote introductory essays. After more than 80 years, Zapfe's major work became accessible to international audiences. Why did it take so long? Partly language barrier, partly subject matter. Philosophical pessimism has never been popular. Antinatalism even less so. A 600-page Norwegian treatise on consciousness as tragedy wasn't going to find commercial publishers eager to make it available. But the delay reveals something else. Ideas this dark don't spread easily. They require readers willing to engage with conclusions that most people spend their lives avoiding. The 4 mechanisms exist precisely to prevent this kind of thinking from taking hold. Publishing Om de tragiske in English means making it possible for more people to encounter ideas that might damage their carefully constructed protections. After liberation, Zapffe turned down a professorship. He could have had academic security, institutional position, students to influence. He chose freelance existence instead, living by essays, monographs, poetry, plays, humorous writings, many about mountain climbing, which he described as meaningless as life itself. The rejection of institutional position fits perfectly. Universities are anchoring mechanisms. They provide structure, purpose, identity. Professor Zapffe would have had a role to play, expectations to meet, a place in the academic hierarchy. All of this would have been protection against the reality he'd spent his life examining. Better to remain outside, to write what he wanted, to climb mountains and document the experience, to live as close to his philosophy as possible while still remaining functional in society. Because that's the compromise everyone makes who understands what Zapffe understood. You can see the horror, you can recognize the mechanisms, you can refuse to pretend they're anything other than survival strategies. But you can't actually live without them. Not completely. You'd go mad. Or die. So you choose which mechanisms to use and which to reject. You find the ones that seem most honest, that admit what they're doing, and you keep going because biology won't let you stop. Zapffe even climbed Tromsø Cathedral's spire once. When he reached the top, he proclaimed he couldn't ascend further by means of the church. Perfect encapsulation of his relationship with religion. Another anchoring mechanism. Another human construction designed to make existence bearable. He could climb the physical structure. He couldn't accept the metaphysical one. After World War II, he taught introductory philosophy at the University of Oslo as a freelancer, not a professor, not institutional, just someone sharing what he'd learned about consciousness and existence with students willing to listen. The course must have been remarkable. Imagine sitting through Zapffe's Introduction to Philosophy. Most intro courses present the discipline as a search for truth or meaning. His would have explained why that search is doomed and how we cope with the failure. His later years continued the pattern established earlier. Writing, climbing when able, photography, living with Berit, watching the world change in ways his philosophy predicted. More development, more destruction, more consciousness expanding into spaces it shouldn't reach. The tragedy unfolding exactly as expected. He died October 12th, 1990, 90 years old. By then, environmentalism had become mainstream. Deep ecology had spread worldwide. His friend Arne Næss, the one he'd cut off for not taking life seriously enough, had become the movement's founder. Zapffe's eco-philosophical warnings about human consciousness destroying nature were being validated everywhere. The mountains he'd climbed were more accessible than ever. Trails marked, routes documented, tourism expanding, everything he'd feared. Berit was with him until the end, 48 years together. She survived him by 18 years, dying in May 2008. No children, no descendants to carry the name or the ideas, exactly as he'd advocated. Be infertile and let the earth be silent after you. He'd followed his own instruction completely. The obituaries were respectful. Norway's eco-philosopher, pioneering mountaineer, brilliant writer, but they couldn't capture what made him significant. How do you explain someone whose entire philosophy was about explaining why explanation fails? His photographs remain in Norwegian archives, thousands of images documenting the northern landscape, mountains, fjords, ice, rock. The world as it existed before human consciousness tried to make sense of it. Pure documentation without interpretation, or with interpretation limited to what the camera could capture. The climbing stories in Barska Gleder still read fresh. That description of a sleeping bag as an artificial fur which man creeps in to sleep in an otherwise deathly climate contains everything. Humans creating technology to survive in environments we're not designed for. The consciousness that lets us understand we don't belong. The mechanisms we build to survive anyway. His environmental philosophy looks prescient now. Climate change validates every warning about human consciousness exceeding nature's design. We understood what we were doing. We did it anyway. The mechanisms kept working. Norway named a peak after him in 1987. Zapfes Tind in Kvaløya. The highest summit of Hollenderen, which he'd first climbed in 1926. Fitting that a mountain he'd reached before anyone else would carry his name permanently. Mountains don't care about consciousness or tragedy. They just exist. But here's what's strange about Zapfe's legacy. His philosophy explains why it can't spread widely. The four mechanisms prevent most people from engaging with ideas this dark, which means his work will always remain marginal. Not because it's wrong, because accepting it requires dismantling the protections that make normal life possible. The Last Messiah ends with that inverted biblical command: be infertile, let the earth be silent. It's the logical conclusion of his entire system. If consciousness is the problem, the solution is preventing more consciousness from emerging. No new humans means no new suffering. Except Zapffe kept living, kept writing, kept climbing, kept using the mechanisms he'd identified. This creates an apparent contradiction. If existence is tragic and consciousness is the disease, why continue? Why not just stop? The answer is in the biology he studied. Organisms don't get to choose whether they continue. The drive to survive operates below consciousness. You can understand that life is meaningless. You can recognize suffering as inherent. You still wake up hungry, still feel pain when injured, still experience the biological imperative to persist. Zapfe's response was to live as honestly as possible within these constraints. Reject the mechanisms that seemed most dishonest. Use only the ones you could acknowledge as mechanisms. Sublimation through writing, limited anchoring through relationships and work, minimal distraction, isolation deployed consciously. The philosophy doesn't offer comfort. That's the point. Comfort is another mechanism, another way of limiting consciousness to bearable levels. Zapffe refused comfort in favor of clarity. His influence shows up in unexpected places. Thomas Ligotti's horror fiction explores the same territory. Eugene Thacker's philosophical horror builds on similar foundations. Antinatalist philosophy has grown since his death, though it remains deeply unpopular. David Benatar's Better Never to Have Been extends arguments Zapffe made decades earlier. But these remain niche interests. Most people never encounter Zapffel's ideas. Those who do usually reject them quickly. The mechanisms activate immediately. This is too dark, too nihilistic, too depressing. Better to think about something else, which proves the theory. If the ideas were wrong, they wouldn't need to be rejected so forcefully. You don't build elaborate defenses against falsehood. You build them against truth that threatens your ability to function. Consider how we talk about consciousness now. It's always framed as humanity's great achievement. What separates us from animals? What makes us special? The thing that gives life meaning. Zapffe inverted this completely. Consciousness is the defect, the mutation that went too far, the adaptation that exceeded its useful parameters. We're not elevated by awareness, we're crippled by it. Every other animal lives within its Umwelt, the world as it appears to that organism. Functional, bounded, sufficient. A bird doesn't question whether flying has meaning. A fish doesn't wonder if swimming serves a purpose. They exist within the parameters their consciousness allows. Humans broke through those parameters. We can question everything, including whether questioning has value. We can see ourselves from outside, can imagine not existing, can comprehend our own mortality, can understand the universe doesn't care about us. This should have been an extinction event. A species that develops the capacity to recognize existence as meaningless should stop reproducing, should lose the will to continue, should collapse into paralysis. Instead, we developed the mechanisms, 4 categories of protection that let consciousness continue despite understanding its own futility. Isolation, anchoring, distraction, sublimation. The biological imperative to survive found psychological tools to overcome the knowledge that survival has no purpose. Zapffe saw this as tragedy, not in the literary sense, in the existential sense. We're trapped in a situation we can't escape, conscious enough to see the trap, not conscious enough to free ourselves. Biology won't let us stop. Consciousness won't let us forget. The only honest response is acknowledging the trap while refusing to create more trapped beings. Antinatalism isn't about hating life or children. It's about recognizing that existence imposes suffering without consent. Creating new consciousness means creating new suffering. The ethical response is to stop. This argument has never been popular and never will be. It threatens the deepest biological drives. The mechanisms activate instantly. People who consider antinatalism seriously often experience psychological crisis. The protections start failing. Better to reject the idea immediately. Zapffe understood this. He didn't expect the philosophy to spread. He didn't think humanity would voluntarily stop reproducing. The Last Messiah describes what would happen if someone fully accepted the implications. They'd become a prophet of extinction, the final voice telling humanity to end its line. But it's self-contradictory. A Messiah is supposed to save people. This Messiah's message is that salvation means non-existence. It's an anti-message from an anti-prophet, the ultimate subversion of religious hope. And Zapffe knew it wouldn't work. Biology is too strong. The mechanisms are too effective. Consciousness can understand it should stop, biology keeps it going anyway. So what was the point of his work? If the philosophy can't change anything, if the mechanisms prevent its acceptance, if humanity will continue regardless, why write it? Maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the point wasn't to change humanity. Maybe it was simply to articulate what he'd discovered, to document the trap as clearly as possible, to leave a record for the few people who could handle reading it. Sublimation, taking the unbearable knowledge and transforming it into something that can be examined. Written down, shared. Not because sharing will fix anything, because the alternative is keeping it locked inside, where it destroys you faster. His climbing writing does something similar. He describes mountains as meaningless, climbing as pointless. But the descriptions are beautiful. They make you want to climb. They celebrate the physical experience, even while denying it has purpose. This is the paradox at the center of Zapffe's life. He saw existence as tragic and continued existing. He identified the mechanisms and kept using them. He advocated antinatalism and lived 90 years. He wrote that life was meaningless and filled his life with meaning anyway. Critics call this inconsistency, but it's not. It's honesty about the human condition. You can't escape biology, you can only understand what it's doing to you. And maybe that understanding is worth something, even if it can't change the fundamental situation. The photographs matter here. Visual documentation requires less interpretation than writing. You point the camera. You capture what's there. The image exists independent of consciousness, trying to make sense of it. Zapffe's thousands of mountain photographs are consciousness trying to step back, to see the world without the overlay of meaning, to document existence before meaning destroys it. They're sublimation in its purest form. Norway archived them as cultural heritage. Future generations can look at these images and see the landscape as it appeared to someone who understood that seeing has no purpose. The mountains don't care that they're photographed. The photographs don't change the mountains, but consciousness needed to capture them anyway. His friendship with Arne Næss ending makes sense in this context. Næss developed deep ecology, the idea that nature has intrinsic value, that all living things deserve consideration, that humans should see themselves as part of nature rather than separate from it. This is anchoring, creating a value system that gives life meaning. Næss built an entire philosophy around protecting nature, because nature matters. It's beautiful, it's important, it deserves preservation. Zapffe couldn't accept this, not because he didn't love nature. His entire life was spent in mountains. His photographs show deep appreciation for landscape. His environmental writing predated deep ecology by decades, but he understood that nature has value is a human construction, an anchoring mechanism. Nature doesn't value itself. It doesn't care whether humans destroy it. The mountains will remain after humanity ends. The earth will continue. Consciousness is what imposes the concept of value onto indifferent processes. Næss took life seriously by creating meaning where none exists. Zapffe took life seriously by refusing to pretend meaning exists. Both loved nature, both wanted to preserve it. But Zapffe's reasons were different. Not because nature has intrinsic value, because human consciousness destroys everything it touches, and maybe we should stop touching things. This is why they couldn't remain friends. Not animosity, not disagreement about facts. Fundamental incompatibility in how they handled the same knowledge. Næss built, Zapffe dismantled. Næss found hope, Zapffe found honesty. The question that remains is what to do with Zapffe's philosophy now, assuming you've made it this far, assuming the mechanisms haven't activated to reject everything you've heard. You can't live by this philosophy completely, not and remain functional. The mechanisms exist because they're necessary. Consciousness without protection destroys itself. You need isolation, anchoring, distraction, sublimation. You need them to survive, but you can acknowledge what they are. You can use them consciously rather than pretending they're truth. You can limit your consciousness deliberately instead of believing the limitations are reality. That's probably what Zapffe would suggest. Not that he offered advice. He documented what he'd discovered. What others did with it was their problem. His death in 1990 came just as the world was changing in ways that proved his philosophy. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. Liberal democracy seemed ascendant. Francis Fukuyama declared the end of history. Zapffe would have recognized this as massive collective anchoring. Humanity deciding that progress was inevitable, that consciousness had solved its problems, that the future would be better. Classic mechanism deployment on civilizational scale. 30 years later, that anchoring has weakened. Climate crisis, democratic backsliding, existential risk from technology. The optimism of 1990 looks naive now. The mechanisms are failing at the collective level, which means more people might be ready to encounter ideas like Zapffe's. Not because the ideas have changed, because the protections are cracking. When anchoring fails, consciousness expands to fill the space. And when consciousness expands, it encounters the horror Zapffe spent his life documenting. The horror isn't abstract anymore. It's climate data showing trajectories we can't reverse. It's algorithms optimizing engagement by exploiting psychological vulnerabilities. It's political systems failing to address existential threats because short-term thinking dominates. The mechanisms that protected previous generations are breaking down under the weight of information consciousness can no longer successfully ignore. Social media functions as forced awareness. You can't isolate disturbing thoughts when they arrive as notifications. You can't anchor to institutions when those institutions visibly collapse in real time. You can't distract from global problems when global problems dominate every feed. The mechanisms require ignorance to function. The information age makes ignorance impossible. This explains the mental health crisis in developed nations. Not that life has gotten materially worse. By most objective measures, it's gotten better. Less poverty, less violence, longer lifespans. But consciousness expands to fill available space. And when consciousness expands beyond the mechanism's ability to contain it, you get what Zapffe predicted: widespread recognition that something fundamental is wrong. The response has been to develop new mechanisms. Wellness culture as anchoring, mindfulness as isolation, productivity optimization as distraction. These work temporarily. They help people function, but they're addressing symptoms, not causes. You can't meditate away the fundamental problem of consciousness, encountering its own nature. Zapffe would recognize these developments as confirmation, not vindication. He didn't want to be right. He just documented what he observed. The fact that his observations predicted developments decades later doesn't make them more true. They were always true. It just took the world catching up for others to notice. His personal life remained consistent with his philosophy. The second marriage to Berit lasted until his death. 38 years. She understood what she was getting. A man who'd chosen not to have children because creating new consciousness was cruel. A man who spent months in mountains because meaningless beauty was preferable to meaningful suffering. A man who wrote humour because laughing at absurdity was more honest than pretending it had purpose. The photographs he took document a specific relationship with landscape. Not conquest, not even appreciation in the traditional sense, more like witnessing. The mountains existed. He was there. The camera captured both facts without adding interpretation. Thousands of images archived now as cultural heritage, evidence that someone looked at the world and saw it clearly enough not to impose meaning where none existed. His environmental philosophy predated modern environmentalism by decades, but reached different conclusions. The contemporary movement argues humans should protect nature because nature has value. Intrinsic value, moral standing, rights perhaps. This is anchoring at civilizational scale, creating a value system that makes environmental destruction feel wrong. Zapffe's position was simpler and more disturbing. Humans should leave nature alone because human consciousness destroys everything it touches. Not because nature is sacred, because consciousness is profane. The mountains don't need protection from exploitation. They need protection from meaning, from being turned into resources or symbols or anything other than what they are. Indifferent geology shaped by indifferent processes. This distinction matters because it affects proposed solutions. If nature has intrinsic value, then sustainable development is possible. Humans can use nature responsibly. We can find balance. We can create systems where both consciousness and environment thrive. This is the foundation of most environmental policy. If consciousness itself is the problem, sustainability is impossible. Any human interaction with nature imposes consciousness onto unconsciousness. Even preservation requires deciding what to preserve and why. Even protection requires judgment about what matters. The only honest solution is withdrawal, reduction, eventually elimination. The last Messiah's conclusion followed this logic. The man who finally understands everything, who achieves complete consciousness, who sees the full horror of existence, delivers the final message. Be infertile. Let the earth be silent after you. Stop creating new consciousness. Stop perpetuating the error. Zapffe lived this, no children, deliberate choice. He could have had descendants. He chose not to impose consciousness on beings who never asked to exist. This wasn't depression or misanthropy. It was consistency. If consciousness is suffering, and suffering is inevitable for consciousness, creating more consciousness is creating more suffering. Simple math. The philosophical question is whether this conclusion is correct, not whether it follows from the premises, it clearly does, but whether the premises are true. Is consciousness really overdeveloped? Is the suffering really unavoidable? Is meaning really just a defensive mechanism? You can't answer this objectively. The mechanisms activate immediately when you try. Your mind generates objections, reasons why life has value, examples of meaning that feel real, evidence that consciousness is gift, not curse. These responses are exactly what Zapffe predicted. The mechanisms protecting you from full awareness. But maybe the mechanisms are right. Maybe limiting consciousness is the correct response to reality. Maybe isolation, anchoring, distraction, and sublimation aren't failures to face truth. Maybe they're successful adaptations that allow consciousness to continue existing despite its inherent problems. Evolution doesn't care about truth, it cares about reproduction. If the mechanisms help consciousness reproduce, they're working correctly. This is where Zapffe's philosophy eats itself. If the mechanisms are necessary for survival and consciousness has survived, then the mechanisms are correct. The full awareness Zapffe advocated would lead to extinction, which means advocating for full awareness is advocating for extinction, which means the philosophy is self-eliminating. Anyone who fully accepts it stops reproducing. The philosophy dies with its adherents, unless that's the point, unless extinction is the correct outcome, unless consciousness recognizing its own error and choosing to end is the ultimate achievement. The last Messiah delivering the message that finally stops the cycle. Be infertile, let the earth be silent. Consciousness achieving enough understanding to undo itself. The problem is you can't advocate for this without contradiction. The moment you tell others to be infertile, you're creating meaning. You're anchoring to antinatalism as a value. You're using sublimation to transform horror into philosophy. You're deploying the mechanisms while claiming the mechanisms are wrong. Zapffe recognized this. His work is self-undermining. It has to be. Any attempt to communicate the horror requires using the defences against the horror. This is why he called it biosophy instead of philosophy, not love of wisdom, thinking on life, observation without prescription. He documented what consciousness encounters when it looks at itself clearly. What others did with that information wasn't his responsibility. He wasn't building a movement. He wasn't saving anyone. He was writing down what he saw. The tragedy is that the observations are probably correct. Consciousness does seem overdeveloped for its biological context. The mechanisms do seem like defensive adaptations. Meaning does appear to be constructed rather than discovered. The suffering does look inherent rather than accidental. These aren't comfortable conclusions, but discomfort doesn't make them false. What you do with this depends entirely on which mechanisms you deploy. You can isolate it, dismiss these thoughts as depressing philosophy from a pessimistic Norwegian. Move on with your life. This works for most people most of the time. You can anchor to something. Decide that even if meaning is constructed meaning is sufficient. Religion, relationships, projects, causes. Build something to focus on. This works too. You can distract yourself. Stay busy. Fill consciousness with immediate concerns that don't leave room for existential questions. Modern life makes this easy. There's always another notification, another task, another entertainment option. You can sublimate. Turn the horror into art or philosophy or humour. Transform it into something that feels productive. This is what Zapffe did. His climbing stories, his photographs, his essays. All sublimation. All using consciousness to protect consciousness from itself. None of these solutions are wrong. They're how consciousness survives. The question isn't whether to use the mechanisms. You're already using them. You've been using them your entire life. The question is whether to acknowledge what you're doing, whether to use them consciously instead of unconsciously, whether to admit that the protection is necessary because the thing it's protecting against is real. Zapffe died in 1990 without resolving these questions. He couldn't resolve them. They're unresolvable. Consciousness examining consciousness will always generate paradoxes. The tool can't fully analyze itself. The eye can't see itself seeing. Any attempt to achieve complete awareness runs into the problem that awareness itself is part of what needs to be understood. His legacy is the documentation, the careful description of how consciousness works when it works correctly, and what it encounters when it looks beneath its own functioning. The mechanisms aren't failures, they're features. They're what allow consciousness to continue despite encountering truths that would otherwise stop it. Whether this is good or bad depends on whether you think consciousness should continue. Zapffe suggested it shouldn't, that the error should be corrected, that the last Messiah should arrive and deliver the final message. Be infertile. But he also knew this message would be rejected. The mechanisms would activate. People would find reasons why consciousness should continue. They'd anchor to meaning, distract from horror, isolate the disturbing thoughts, sublimate the fear into hope. And they'd be right to do so, not because consciousness isn't an error, but because errors that successfully perpetuate themselves become features. Evolution doesn't distinguish between mistakes and adaptations. It only distinguishes between what survives and what doesn't. Consciousness survives. Therefore, consciousness works. The fact that it causes suffering is irrelevant to its evolutionary success. This is the final horror. Not that consciousness is an error, but that errors can be self-sustaining, that systems can perpetuate themselves despite causing suffering, that there's no cosmic correction mechanism that eliminates bad designs. Natural selection doesn't care about suffering, it only cares about reproduction. If consciousness reproduces successfully while causing suffering, the suffering continues, forever, or until something else stops it. Zapffe documented all of this in essays and books that most people never read. The Last Messiah remained obscure for decades. On the tragic was never translated into English until 2024. His ideas circulated mainly in Norway, mainly among philosophers, mainly as interesting but impractical observations about human nature. He was respected but not influential, admired but not followed. This might be exactly right. Ideas this disturbing shouldn't be influential. They should remain at the margins, accessible to those who need to encounter them, but not forced on those whose mechanisms are working fine. Most people don't need to know that meaning is constructed. The construction works, let it work. But for those whose mechanisms are failing, whose consciousness has expanded beyond their ability to contain it, whose isolation and anchoring and distraction and sublimation no longer protect them from encountering the horror directly, Zapffe offers something unusual. Not hope, not comfort, not solutions. Just accurate description of what they're experiencing. Confirmation that the horror is real. That consciousness really does encounter this when it looks clearly at itself. That the mechanisms really are necessary. That using them isn't weakness or failure. It's survival. You're using them right now. Probably isolation, deciding this is just philosophy, not reality. Maybe anchoring, finding reasons why your life has meaning despite everything you've heard. Possibly distraction, already thinking about what you'll do after this ends. Certainly sublimation, if you've made it this far, transforming disturbing ideas into intellectual exercise. All of this is correct. All of this is necessary. All of this is how consciousness protects itself from consciousness. Zapffe spent 90 years documenting this process, climbing mountains that didn't care whether he climbed them, taking photographs of landscapes that didn't need to be photographed, writing essays about the mechanisms while deploying the mechanisms, living the contradiction. He never resolved it. He just lived it until he died. The mountains are still there. The photographs are archived. The books remain in print. The ideas continue circulating among people whose consciousness has expanded beyond comfortable limits. Nothing essential has changed. The mechanisms still function. Consciousness still survives. The horror remains. And life continues anyway, because continuing is what life does even when consciousness understands exactly why it shouldn't. October 12th, 1990. Peter Wessel Zapffe stops breathing. Beer is with him. He's 90 years old. His body simply gives out. The biological imperative that kept him going despite everything finally releases its hold. There's no deathbed revelation, no final wisdom, no conversion to optimism at the last moment. He dies the way he lived, aware of what consciousness is, aware of what it costs, using the mechanisms to survive anyway. Norway mourns a philosopher and mountaineer. The obituaries are respectful. They mention his environmental advocacy, his climbing achievements, his philosophical contributions. They don't quite capture the central fact of his existence. He spent 90 years looking directly at something most people spend their lives avoiding. Berit lives another 18 years. She dies in 2008. Together, they left no children. The line ends exactly as intended. Two people who understood the implications of consciousness and refused to perpetuate it into another generation. The ideas don't die with them. That's the strange thing about philosophy. Once written down, it persists, independent of its creator. The books remain. The essays circulate. The Last Messiah continues finding readers who encounter it at the exact moment their mechanisms are failing. Which brings us to now. Why does any of this matter? Zapffe died over 30 years ago. His major work remained untranslated for 83 years. He was never famous outside Norway. Most people have never heard his name, but the mechanisms are failing at scale now. Climate data arrives faster than isolation can dismiss it. Institutional anchoring collapses as institutions visibly break. Distraction becomes harder when the distractions themselves feel empty. Even sublimation struggles when consciousness expands too far to contain. This explains the resurgence of interest, not in Zapffe specifically, in philosophical pessimism generally. David Benatar's work on antinatalism, Thomas Ligotti's horror fiction, the growing discourse around whether creating new life is ethical. These aren't random developments, they're consciousness encountering limits that previous generations didn't face. Previous generations could isolate more effectively. Information moved slower. You could avoid knowing things. Now you can't. The algorithm ensures awareness. Previous generations could anchor more successfully. Institutions seemed stable. Progress felt real. Now everything appears temporary. Previous generations could distract more completely. Entertainment was finite. Now it's infinite, and somehow more boring. Sublimation still works, but you need bigger doses. The horror keeps breaking through. Zapffe predicted this without predicting specifics. He understood that the mechanisms require certain conditions to function. When those conditions change, consciousness expands. And when consciousness expands beyond protective capacity, people start encountering the same observations he made decades earlier. The question isn't whether his philosophy is correct. That's the wrong question. The question is whether his description of consciousness matches your experience of consciousness. Does meaning feel constructed or discovered? Do the four mechanisms seem like accurate descriptions of what you do? Does existence feel tragic or purposeful? Your answer determines whether Zapffe matters to you. If the mechanisms are working, if isolation and anchoring and distraction and sublimation successfully contain consciousness within manageable bounds, you don't need his philosophy. It's just interesting historical documentation of one man's particularly dark worldview. But if the mechanisms are failing, if consciousness keeps expanding despite your attempts to limit it, if you find yourself encountering the horror more frequently, then Zapffe offers something unusual. Not solutions, he doesn't have solutions, but accurate description of what you're experiencing, confirmation that others have seen it too. Documentation of how consciousness functions when it stops protecting itself from itself. This is probably his actual legacy, not the antinatalism, which remains fringe, not the environmental philosophy, which was superseded by more optimistic approaches. The legacy is the framework, the four mechanisms as descriptive tools, the recognition that consciousness requires protection from reality, the observation that meaning is something we create rather than discover. You can use this framework without accepting his conclusions. You can acknowledge that anchoring is a mechanism while still anchoring to something. You can recognize distraction as defensive while still using distraction. The description works independently of the prescription. Zapffe showed how consciousness operates. What you do with that knowledge is separate from whether the knowledge is accurate. The photographs matter here in ways that aren't obvious. Thousands of images documenting northern landscapes, mountains, fjords, ice, rock, pure observation without imposed meaning. This is consciousness trying to step back, trying to see without interpreting, trying to capture reality before meaning destroys it. Most fail. Photography is inherently selective. The frame imposes meaning through what it includes and excludes, but the attempt matters. Consciousness trying to witness rather than interpret, trying to document rather than explain. The gesture towards something beyond the mechanisms, even when the gesture itself requires using mechanisms. His climbing writing does something similar, describing mountaineering as meaningless while making it vivid and compelling, celebrating the physical experience while denying it has purpose. The contradiction is the point. You can recognize absurdity and engage with it anyway. Recognition doesn't require withdrawal. It just requires honesty about what you're doing. The sleeping bag description captures everything. An artificial fur which man creeps in to sleep in an otherwise deathly climate. Perfect observation. The sleeping bag is technology allowing survival in environments we're not designed for. Like the mechanisms allowing consciousness to survive insights it's not designed to handle. Both are artificial solutions to real problems. Both work. Neither eliminates the underlying issue. You can extend this metaphor across everything humans do. Culture is an artificial fur. Religion is an artificial fur. Philosophy is an artificial fur. All of it is consciousness creating protection against reality. All of it works well enough that consciousness continues. None of it changes what consciousness encounters when protection fails. Zapffel's relationship with Arne Næss demonstrates the limits of shared interests when fundamental orientations diverge. They climbed the same mountains. They studied the same philosophy. They respected each other's intelligence. But Næss built meaning where Zapffe saw construction. Næss found hope where Zapffe found honesty. The gap proved unbridgeable. Deep ecology says nature has intrinsic value. Humans should protect it because it matters. This creates purpose. This gives consciousness something to anchor to. It works beautifully for building environmental movements and motivating protection efforts. Zapffe saw this as another mechanism. Nature doesn't value itself. Consciousness imposes value onto indifferent processes. The mountains don't care whether humans protect them or destroy them. They're just geology. Saying they have intrinsic value is consciousness creating meaning to make its existence bearable. Both positions lead to protecting nature, but the reasons matter because they determine what protection means. If nature has intrinsic value, sustainable development is possible. Humans can find balance. If consciousness is the problem, withdrawal is the only honest response. The difference isn't academic. It affects what solutions seem viable. The Last Messiah remains his most concentrated statement. 10 pages. Published in 1933. Ignored for decades. Then slowly finding audiences whose mechanisms were failing at the right moment to encounter it. The essay's structure is almost biblical. Prophetic voice describing the final messenger. The man who achieves complete consciousness, who sees everything without protection, who delivers the ultimate message. Be infertile. Let the earth be silent after you. It's self-contradicting. A Messiah is supposed to save. This Messiah's message is extinction. A prophet is supposed to bring hope. This prophet brings honesty. The inversion is deliberate.